Hello friends, forgetting all the warmth of summer. Today, we are traveling to one of the most challenging periods in history, the medieval winter. My life as a city dweller meant constant fear of hunger and struggle against the cold. Therefore, winter was not a moment of rest, but a fight where only the strongest survived. To protect myself from freezing, I combined my house with the barn and gave my last firewood to the church. You will be amazed when you learn these interesting rituals and the battle for survival. If you are ready, let's jump into the video. But first, don't forget to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss future historical lives. In the Middle Ages, preparations for winter were not just a simple seasonal transition, but a life or death struggle for my agricultural life. The entire harvest of summer and autumn was the single measure that determined the time the whole family would survive. The most important provisions during this period were grains, barley, rye, root vegetables, turnips, carrots, and salted meats. Food storage methods in winter were quite primitive. Vegetables were often buried in the ground or kept in cool, dark cellars, which increased the risk of spoilage. Since experiencing famine in the middle of winter led almost certainly to death, provisions were rationed extremely strictly. Every peasant household had to stock enough flour for bread and animal feed, hay and grass to get through the winter. The early arrival or unexpectedly long duration of winter would completely overturn all calculations. These preparations not only fed the stomach, but also maintained the spiritual resilience of the community. Prayers offered as winter approached and post-harvest Thanksgiving ceremonies helped bring a ray of hope to this challenging period. This was the most stressful time of my life. The stock of firewood was the most critical and difficult part of surviving the winter. Finding would often require months of exhausting labor from the young and strong members of the family. Forests usually belonged to the lords, and wood collection was limited by strict rules and taxes. To avoid freezing to death in the middle of winter, peasants collected not only wood but also alternative fuels such as dried dung and brushwood. During the periods of most severe cold, saving fuel was vital, and therefore all family members and animals would gather under one roof, usually in the living area adjacent to the barn. This practice aimed to achieve maximum warmth with minimum fuel by utilizing heat from both human bodies and the animals. When the firewood stock dwindled, it caused panic in the village, as it meant danger not only from the cold but also from the inability to cook and thus hunger. My life was directly proportional to the height of the woodpile. In the medieval winter, diseases were not just simple ailments, but disasters that could end the community. Due to the closed and crowded living spaces, houses adjacent to the barn in winter, infectious diseases flu, typhus, tuberculosis spread very quickly. Malnutrition and vitamin deficiency weakened the immune system, causing even the simplest infections to become deadly. Finding clean water was difficult in winter due to icy waters or frozen springs, which further led to the deterioration of hygiene. Peasants used herbal remedies and concoctions to protect against illness, but most of them lacked scientific basis. When disease spread, patients were usually not separated from other healthy family members because there was no space to separate them, which accelerated the rate of the epidemic. Especially the elderly and children affected by the cold had the highest risk of death. Winter was also one of the most active periods for great epidemics like the plague, as people lived closer together. This threat was a constant shadow over my life. In the medieval winter, it was a hardship even for the lords and nobles, but their difficulty was a luxury compared to the suffering experienced by the peasants. Although the lords were safer in terms of food stock, the massive stone walls and high ceilings of the castles made it extremely difficult to heat their interiors. Fireplaces constantly burned, but cold drafts and humidity reduced the comfort of living. The lords were not immune to the risk of famine and disease in winter either. However, their greatest difficulty was experiencing loss of income because military operations stopped in winter and the productivity of the peasants on their lands was zeroed out. Knights and soldiers remained inactive in their barracks, settling for salted meat and beer from the summer instead of grand feasts. Towards the end of winter, even the nobles could experience provision shortages, but they would try to compensate for this by forcefully taking taxes from the peasants. Winter was the period that showed the class division in medieval society most sharply. In the medieval peasant struggle against winter, animal power was a vital heating strategy and also the greatest insurance for my life. The combination of barns and living areas, longhouse-style structures, not only saved fuel but also allowed the animal's body heat to spread into the house. Cows, pigs, and even chickens served as the most effective heating systems of that era. Although this proximity led to hygiene issues and disease risk, it was better than freezing to death. Animals were also the family's guarantee of survival for the next year, a source of milk, meat, hide, and fertilizer. Losing animals in winter meant the financial and physical collapse of a family. Therefore, the feeding and sheltering of animals during the winter could take priority even over humans. Although this seems primitive by modern standards, it was the most practical and common way to survive the medieval winter. This necessary proximity also reinforced the deep bond peasants had with their animals. Winter was not just a physical hardship, but also a period of spiritual warfare. In the medieval Christian belief system, winter was associated with sin, death, and evil. Churches organized more intense ceremonies during this period, trying to keep the spiritual strength and hope of the peasants alive. Peasants fasted in winter to atone for their sins, making small donations of food or firewood to the church on the commemoration days of the saints. These donations also helped the church get through the winter. The prayers offered during this period aimed to bring back the fertility of the field and to ensure the weather softened. Churches, especially with winter festivals like Christmas and Epiphany, provided the community with short periods of joy and togetherness. However, this spiritual consolation could not completely eliminate the fear of famine and plague, while believing the church would protect them. Peasants also used local rituals and amulets to protect themselves from supernatural evils, evil spirits, witches. The interiors of homes in winter were constantly filled with dampness, soot, and smoke. Ventilation was poor because windows were either non-existent or covered only with wooden shutters. Glass was considered a luxury. Open hearths and fireplaces used for heating polluted the air inside the house, causing the spread of respiratory diseases. This closed and polluted air was a constant problem that lowered the quality of my life. Peasants tried to use the best wood in their hearths to reduce smoke and soot, but this was not always possible. Clothes were rarely washed and constantly smelled of dampness. High humidity and poor air quality were a great danger, especially for infants and the elderly. These harsh hygiene and living conditions in the middle of winter were a testament to the resilience and determination of the medieval person to survive. In the medieval winter, time was not measured by hours, as in modern societies, but by the cycle of the sun and the length of the day. Short days and long, dark nights radically changed people's work rhythm. With the halt of agricultural work, winter was a necessary period of rest and confinement. However, this rest did not mean idleness. Women were busy with important indoor tasks, such as mending, sewing, spinning yarn, and weaving wool. Men focused on less physically demanding tasks such as tool repair, wood carving, and hunting in the snow. Winter nights offered a long opportunity for social activities such as storytelling, singing, and reading religious texts if they were literate. These social interactions were vital for boosting the community's morale and ensuring the transmission of knowledge. This slowing rhythm of winter provided a psychological resilience against the hardships of my life. However, under this silence, the fear of hunger and disease always lurked. Hunting in winter was a vital food source for the medieval peasant, but it also carried a great risk. Although snow made tracking game easier, the depth of the snow and the freezing cold could put the hunter in a dangerous situation. Hunting rights usually belonged to the lords, so peasants often had to hunt secretly and illegally poaching. The penalty for being caught could be severe flogging or loss of a limb. Peasants especially aimed to hunt animals like rabbits, birds, and sometimes small deer. The method of preserving meat in winter was salting or drying. This ensured it lasted for a long time during periods of scarcity. The meat obtained from hunting was not only sustenance, but also a symbol of survival and defiance against the lord's oppression. A successful hunt in winter significantly increased the survival chances of the entire household. This struggle was one of the sharpest risks of my life. The tasks undertaken by women throughout the medieval winter were the invisible pillars of survival. With the halt of agricultural production, women completely took over indoor production and administration. The most crucial task was managing food stocks and using existing provisions most efficiently. Women spun wool, wove fabric, and mended the entire family's clothes throughout the winter. A tear or unraveling in a garment meant a reduction in protection against the cold, which was a direct health hazard. Furthermore, women nursed and provided herbal remedies for children born at home in winter and sick family members. The long winter nights were the times when grandmothers and mothers recounted family and community history to the children, transmitting the oral tradition. This meticulous and continuous work by women allowed the men to focus on dangerous outdoor tasks. The labor of women were the silent heroes of my life. Winter festivals and holidays were not just religious days for the medieval person, but a short escape from fear and hardship. Especially days like Christmas and Epiphany 3 Kings Day were times when the community gathered, rarely sang songs, and held small feasts. These festivals briefly made people forget the fear of hunger and strengthened social solidarity. The feasts were usually made with the best salted meat, nuts, and dried fruits remaining from the summer. Churches kept their interiors warm on these days using the firewood donated by the peasants, providing a temporary shelter for everyone. However, this joy was very fragile. When the festival ended, the peasants had to face the brutal realities of winter again. These holidays were also days when the social hierarchy was displayed. The lords could distribute symbolic gifts or food scraps to the peasants. This short-lived joy was an important spiritual support to endure the hardships of my life. In the medieval winter, water supply was a vital and dangerous task. When rivers and ponds froze, peasants had to either break the thick ice to draw water or melt snow. The task of breaking ice was particularly perilous due to the risk of slipping and falling into the cold water, and it was usually done by the strongest men of the family. Although the water obtained from ice or snow was sometimes clean, the risk of contamination from dirty water beneath the frozen rivers was always present. Therefore, drinking water was usually consumed after boiling or in the form of alcoholic beverages, ale or cider. Water scarcity also restricted hygiene practices. Bathing in winter was a rare event, and clothes were cleaned only when absolutely necessary. This difficulty in water supply affected every aspect of my life. Everything from cooking to animal care was limited by the amount of water obtained. The long, dark nights of winter were the times when supernatural beliefs and superstitions spread the most. Misfortunes, such as animals dying for unknown reasons, people suddenly falling ill, or the field losing its fertility, were directly attributed to witches, evil spirits, or demonic influences. Peasants hung crosses, blessed herbs, or iron objects. Iron was a common tool to ward off evil spirits on their doors and windows for protection in winter. Winter dreams were considered especially important and interpreted as prophecy. Bad dreams were seen as a sign of future famine or disease. The prophecies made during this period deeply affected the psychology of the community. The spiritual tension of winter also increased the authority of the church, as people believed the divine was the only power that could protect them. These superstitions served as a safety net on the peasant's challenging journey called my life, offering an answer to events that lacked logical explanation. The long hours spent indoors in winter were an important opportunity for the development of handicrafts and crafts. The time freed up by the halt of agricultural production allowed peasants to focus on producing tools, furniture, or clothing necessary for themselves and their lords. Men were busy with tasks such as wood carving, basket weaving, and repairing simple tools. These handicrafts ensured economic continuity even in the stagnation of winter. Some produced goods could be sold or traded in the markets in spring. The weaving and sewing skills of women increased the thickness and durability of clothing in winter, thus increasing the family's resistance to the cold. These indoor productions were important not only for survival but also for transmitting knowledge and skills within the family to the next generation. This creative period of winter was a quiet but productive part of my life. In winter, the attire of the medieval person focused on layering and maximizing benefit from animal hides. Clothes were generally made from durable materials like thick wool and linen. The outermost layers were reinforced with animal furs and waxed fabrics to block wind and snow, since feet and hands were the parts of the body that lost the most heat. They were specially protected with wool socks, thick leather shoes, and gloves. As washing clothes was difficult and risky, the layers were often aired out and brushed clean. Clothing not only kept people warm, but also reflected a person's social status. Lords wore finer wools and silks, while peasants settled for coarse and patched garments. Winter attire was the first line of defense for my life against the cold, and the loss or damage of a garment meant a great disaster. Even under these harsh conditions, women tried to add some aesthetics by incorporating small embroideries onto the clothes. In the medieval winter, children's lives were even more challenging than adults. The infant and child mortality rate was very high due to cold, malnutrition, and diseases. Children were kept in the warmest corner of the house, usually adjacent to the barn, throughout the winter and constantly wrapped in thick blankets. Play and entertainment were limited. Children mostly helped with their parents' chores or learned crafts. However, winter was also a period of education and storytelling for children. Tales, religious stories, and legends told during the long nights shaped the children's cultural and spiritual identities. Children learned about the dangers of winter and ways to survive through these stories. Children who survived the winter usually started the arduous agricultural work of summer as more resilient individuals with high adaptation skills. This period was a process where the children's physical and mental endurance was tested. Lighting in winter was on the fine line between luxury and essential need. Peasant households used oil lamps and candles with extreme caution, as both the fuel oil or animal fat and the beeswax were expensive. At night, families generally used only one or two light sources, which resulted in a large part of the house remaining in darkness. The insufficiency of candlelight restricted tasks like indoor crafts and reading. Lighting was more abundant in the lords' castles, but even there, many candles and torches were required to illuminate the vast spaces. In the long winter nights, darkness was not only a physical state, but also created a spiritual atmosphere where fear and supernatural threats increased. Peasants believed that evil spirits roamed in the dark and therefore kept their doors and windows tightly shut. This light restriction was an economic necessity that directly affected the rhythm of my life. As winter's end approached, exhaustion and despair reached their peak. Provisions were about to run out, the weather was still freezing, and the arrival of spring was uncertain. This period was known as the hunger months, and people were often forced to consume the last seeds or roots that were reserved for the animals. This last quarter of winter was the time of the highest death rates, where diseases and hunger were at their most severe. Peasants performed rituals and prayers to speed up the arrival of spring. The church's Lent period further strained already weakened bodies, but aimed to provide endurance through spiritual discipline. When spring arrived and the first greenery sprouted from the ground, it meant not only food, but also a spiritual rebirth. This desperate wait was the greatest test of patience in my life. The spring that followed winter meant a true rebirth for the medieval person. Those who survived the winter immediately returned to the fields to plow the land and sow seeds. The slowing rhythm of winter suddenly changed with the fast and exhausting work of spring. However, this work was under great pressure, as there was no guarantee of survival. The risk of the crops freezing in spring determined whether the entire family would survive the next winter. All the spiritual and physical burden accumulated during winter was lightened by the energy and hope of spring. The deceased were remembered, but there was little time for mourning, as my life had to continue. Spring was a period when the community reasserted its strength and determination. This transition was one of the most prominent and emotional moments of the medieval agricultural cycle. The social consequences of the famine and diseases created by winter were very deep. The population of the villages decreased, and agricultural production capacity dropped. The survivors inherited the possessions and lands of the deceased, which reshaped the social and economic hierarchy. Lords could either exert more pressure on the peasants due to the reduced workforce, or, conversely, be forced to make some concessions to retain labor. Winter left deep traces in the social memory. The stories told emphasized the brutality of winter and the miracle of survival. This experience became a lesson that allowed the community to be better prepared for the next winter. The legacy of winter was part of the medieval person's struggle called my life, and every spring was the triumph of this struggle. The impact of winter in the Middle Ages affected not only the peasants, but also the entire European economy. Frozen rivers and roads completely halted trade. Intercity and international trade was interrupted, causing artisans and merchants to suffer loss of income. Winter also stopped wars and military mobility. Armies retreated to their barracks, which led to a peaceful but challenging period. The production halt brought by winter caused prices to soar and famine speculations to increase. This economic cycle shows that winter was not just a local problem, but a global economic contraction. Under these harsh economic conditions, people could often resort to illegal activities or rebellions against their lords to survive. Winter was not only cold, but also a catalyst for economic and social instability. And so, my life completed its annual cycle in the medieval winter. Every winter was met with lessons learned from the previous one, but the brutality of nature always held new surprises. This challenging period demonstrates the incredible resilience of the medieval person, the strength of community bonds, and the importance of spiritual beliefs in survival. The fear and loss brought by winter were balanced by the hope and rebirth brought by spring. This cycle calls us to understand the value of our modern comforts and to respect this challenging period of history. If you enjoyed this difficult survival story, don't forget to like and subscribe. See you in the next historical life. Goodbye.